There are two types of power supply, the conventional power supply and switch mode power supply. A switch mode power supply typically is made up of a rectifier, filter, a high frequency switch, transformer, a second rectifier, and a filter. In consumer switch mode power supplies, it commonly has a fuse, controller, or pulse width modulator and a fan. While pre-identifying the parts of my switch mode power supply, I noticed that there are too many transformers, capacitors, and rectifying diodes. The more I look into it, this actually makes perfect sense since my power supply can be switched into 110 volts to 220 volts AC, which means it should have a transformer for decreasing the voltage of 220 volts. The second transformer is most likely for stepping down the voltage from the high frequency switch, while the third transformer is probably as a mini power supply for the controller since based on its data sheet of KA7500B switch mode power supply controller, it requires a 42 volts supply voltage. Now, starting with the entire circuit, since we're using 220 volts, it should enter the first transformer to decrease to 110 volts, then the full bridge rectifier, to the capacitors, then to the high frequency switch. In the case of my power supply, it uses a high voltage fast switching NPN power transistor, which is being controlled by a switch mode power supply controller. Next is the transformer, which converts 110 volts AC to a lower voltage around 15 volts, since I can adjust the voltage between 10 to 14 volts using this variable resistor. Next is the rectifier diodes. My power supply uses a Schottky barrier rectifier, which is ideal for rectifying high frequency, low voltage input. And lastly, the filters made up of an inductor and 3 capacitors. Moving on to the other power supply, a conventional power supply mainly made up of a transformer, rectifier, and a filter. Before we identify the parts of my conventional power supply, let me try to make a simple conventional power supply. Conventional power supply is made up of the most basic parts. The transformer, which converts 220 volts to 35 volts AC, a full bridge rectifier, and a 6800 microfarad capacitor. In comparison to my conventional power supply, it also has a transformer, but it only has a half bridge rectifier, 3 capacitors which totals up to 6.6 millifarads. It also has an LED indicator in parallel to the output, a switch in series to the 220 volt AC input, and a 12.5 amp fuse.